pretty rough.
Iklanete, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever time zone you are in today. Thank you for joining us for Indigenous Climate Action's webinar series in the lead up to the COP26 on Indigenous peoples and our work within the United Nations Forum Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of the Party gatherings and meetings that happen every year. Today's session is looking at false solutions. So we're looking at some of the false solutions that are coming out of the COP negotiations and really looking at how Indigenous rights intersect and why we're so concerned with these false solutions. Particularly, we're looking at things like Article 6, which we'll talk a little bit about and give you a bit of a primer. So again, thank you and welcome for joining. And my name is Ariel Ekwi-Deranger. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, and I am based in Amiskwaciy-Waskahigon Treaty 6 territory, also known as Edmonton, Alberta. And I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, which is located in Treaty 8 territory in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. So as a little bit of a background, today we're going to be discussing a bit of the hangover from Madrid COP25. So in 2019 in Madrid at the COP25, there were a lot of negotiations for trying to finalize some of the text of the Paris Agreement. And the one article that remains not agreed upon and is the hangover from Madrid is Article 6. And Article 6 deals with looking at how we can find ways to have internationally agreed upon mechanisms for reducing emissions. These are market-based approaches. So we're talking about carbon markets, systems of trading emissions back and forth to utilize as offsets in our profiles, our nationally determined contributions. So every 5 years or so, it depends, there's agreements changing on 5 to 10 years, countries have to report on how much emissions they're contributing to the global stock take or the global sort of like compilation of emissions from every country. And these are called nationally determined contributions. And within those, they're looking for ways to reduce emissions through carbon offset mechanisms. And through that, they're trying to find ways to mechanize different types of offset programs. These are being coined as false solutions. Since Madrid in 2019, there has been an emergence of a big discourse or discussion and debate around nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions are land-based offsets. So we're talking about nature acting. Before Madrid and before a lot of the last few years, there has always been discussions around ecosystems-based approaches. But we were not putting them into market-based systems. We were always talking about safeguarding biodiversity, rivers, forests, mountainscapes, the different types of biomes and ecosystems that exist on the planet. But now we're talking about commodifying them, putting them into market-based approaches that look to commodify nature. And these are being coined as nature-based solutions. We're not only seeing governments putting forward strategies for nature-based solutions, but this is also being adopted by corporations and civil society environmental organizations. Yet at the heart of all of this, nature-based solutions are ideologies and value systems that exist within our communities. 80% of the world's biodiversity exists within Indigenous lands and territories, and this is not an accident. This comes from thousands of years of intergenerational and traditional ecological knowledge for being stewards of the land, for managing our territories with our language, with our culture, with all of the ways of being in which we relate to the places that we have existed since time immemorial. And these have been co-opted by state leaders, by corporations, and by other civil society organizations to be utilized within a market-based framework. And therein lies real dangers. Today, we have a great group of speakers that will be coming forward and discussing nature-based solutions and other false solutions that are being negotiated within the COP26 and within Article 6 today. And with that, I would like to start today's panel with our first speaker and one of the new staff at Indigenous Climate Action, Rebecca Sinclair, who is our climate research and policy analyst, who's been doing some research projects on nature-based solutions as part of our Decolonizing Climate Policies program. With that, I'd like you to introduce yourself, Rebecca, and invite you to share what you'd like to share on nature-based solutions today with the audience.
Thank you, Gosana Ariel, for that introduction and for that explanation on nature-based solutions. So Tanseo Sawe Maskwa Skoyun Sigarason, Ochinida Barrenlands First Nation and Little Saskatchewan First Nation. I'm originally from Barrenlands First Nation, which is a northern community in Manitoba. And I'm a member of Little Saskatchewan First Nation, which is in the Interlake of Manitoba. And I'm joining everybody from Treaty 1 territory as a guest in Winnipeg. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides prepared for today. Give me a second. And as Ariel mentioned, I am the research and policy analyst at Indigenous Climate Action. So I've been working for the past year on decolonizing climate policy in Canada, which is a report that was released recently. There it is. So in this report, we had talked about really critiquing two main climate policy plans in Canada. Through a critical analysis framework, we critiqued the Pan-Canadian framework and the healthy environment and healthy economy, which I'll call the PCF and the HEHE from now on when I'm referring to them, because it's a mouthful. In this critique, we found that in the process of developing these plans in Canada, Indigenous people, their rights, knowledge and climate leadership were mentioned again and again in both plans, yet Indigenous people were structurally excluded from the decision-making tables where these plans were made. This is importantly concerning, especially when we talk about nature-based solutions and the amount of land grabs that are the potential in Canada. When we're not even included in the national climate plans, how are we expected to be included in plans that, you know, have nature-based solutions or carbon market mechanisms? The exclusion constitutes a violation of Indigenous rights to self-determination, to the free, prior, and informed consent as defined by the United Nations. It conflicts with the Liberal government's commitments to reconciliation and nation-to-nation, Inuit to Crown, and government-to-government relations. When there's a saying I quite often have, and my grandma's real sick of hearing it, when I talk about free, prior, and informed consent, I always like to put up this consideration that does my Kugam understand what you're trying to do on her land? This is a very important component of nature-based solutions, because as I found in elder sharing circles when in Fisher River First Nation, Peguis First Nation, Kinigishtagon, and in all of the surrounding communities in the Interlake, a lot of the times we get the questions like, why are you here? What do you want from us? What are you trying to say to us? And more often than not, we go into these communities, or organizations go into these communities with their environmental jargon, their idea of what environmental protection looks like, without asking or coming to the consideration of Indigenous folks. So decolonizing is redistributing, transferring land, wealth, and decision-making power. And this picture is actually my daughter looking out over the Athabasca River. I think about, I'm trying to be a little bit more or less technical in the way I speak, and thinking consistently of what my Kugam would understand. And what my Kugam would understand is that I need to make sure and ensure that there's a life and a land there for my children and my grandchildren and her grandchildren. So in the report, Decolonizing Climate Policy in Canada, we addressed some of the solutions that were put forth in the PCF and the HEHE, which ignore the realities faced by Indigenous communities and nations. This is a picture from Lynn Lake, Manitoba, which is where I went to grade school and it is a registered ghost town, old abandoned mining town. Some of the solutions that are put forth in the PCF and the HEHE talk about infrastructure and carbon tax, which means the reality that these communities face is an increase in transportation. We don't have electric vehicles in the north, and to think that that's a viable solution for the future is lost on most people up north, because one, the weather doesn't allow for that. Two, the affordability of that, as you can see here in this picture, many homes are I think actually the gray house in this picture, there's somebody living in there, just an FYI. So some of the climate solutions proposed have the potential to lead to ongoing disproportionate negative impacts to Indigenous people and violations of Indigenous rights. So that's that nature-based solutions again. It fails to address the structural inequalities continually reproduced through the ongoing colonial relations and policies in Canada. I want to give space to the fact that I'm feeling a little tired today. As we're preparing for COP26 as an ICA team, I'm feeling like I'm getting a lot more information on a lot more, not just information, but preparedness for this challenge we're going to go on. And it's not lost on me that COP26, when we talk about these structural inequalities of Indigenous folks, that the reality is that not a lot of Indigenous folks are going to make it to COP26 to be able to voice their concerns on these types of issues. So as we're working through our newest report, which is the release is forthcoming. And I do want to also recognize that not all First Nations are on this map, but I want to address that when we talk about First Nation communities and First Nation territory, this is what we're talking about. As you can see, Canada is completely covered by First Nation territory. And I also recognize that this doesn't show our relatives south of the Medicine Line. The total with grasslands, wetlands, forests, and agriculture combined is 71.2% of Canada, which will be targeted for nature-based solutions. And 71.2% overlap with Indigenous territories. That means sacred territories. So we are talking about a much greater area than just reservations or reserves or the res. Like in my mind, and a few other people that we interviewed for our nature-based solutions report or critique on nature-based solutions report that's forthcoming, the big picture here is that this cannot happen without land back. Without giving Indigenous people the full autonomy to that land, I don't see this working. I'm not personally, but I don't see this working without land back. So this is actually my kugum to the right with a little feather on her sweater, and my Cree teacher Madeline Biggity, who are both from Brochet and live there. While doing the interview and for nature-based solutions, we had interviewed Dr. Kyle White, who had made a really important observation that I feel like a lot of us Indigenous folks are feeling at this time too. They'll make it so that Indigenous people that want to participate cannot unless they adopt somebody else's approach of land management. You go to my grandma, you go to my kugum, you go to my Cree teacher, and you come up to them with ideas of what you want to do on their land, they're going to laugh you out the room. They're going to go, okay, you do that. I'm going to go and finish what I'm doing. And that's the very tenet of our Indigenous communities. We're already doing this, and we already have systems in place where we're protecting and preserving these lands. There's already Indigenous methods in that. I think I have some more pictures if this decides not to work on me. Or maybe I'm seeing something different. What are you seeing?
Your kugum.
It's still microcosm, right? Okay, there we go. Okay, so I like to show this picture of the Broken Head wetland because this is a really good conservation effort that was put forth by the Broken Head First Nation community near Winnipeg. In this interpretive trail, it uses language, which I often hear more. I hear quite consistently from elders and knowledge keepers that without language, we don't have that connection to the land. Our protection, our worldview, everything that we have literally comes from the land, including our language. So this was a great trail that I took my children on. My son here in the Eat, Sleep, Fish shirt is at a land-based program that we had done up in Norway House First Nation. Then I take my daughter, who her first time actually holding the fish, but this year we actually learned how to fillet the fish. Like I taught her how to actually do it, and we, didn't have a whole lot of meat left, but we did our best. But this is when we talk about Indigenous-led solutions or nature-based solutions, as it comes from an Indigenous worldview, we're literally talking about that relationship that we have to the land and how we continuously go back to that and learn from that through the languages, through the land-based youth camps. I remember reading a researcher's article on Indigenous-led solutions that had mentioned that there's no solid proof of that or something to that effect. And I was just laughing because I was like thinking, this right here is the proof. My children learning these traditional ways, learning the language and the land that they come from and coming to appreciate that. That's my grandma again. Sorry, my slides are all like messed up here a little bit, I think. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so the glaring issues that nature-based solutions proposes allows this is the biggest thing. It allows the continuation of the fossil fuel production. I use this terminology with recycling or plastic straws and how we have this idea of we can just use paper straws, but we ignore the deforestation issues. We say recycle everywhere, which is a good thing. However, does this continue the consumption issues? Absolutely. We could just recycle it later if we just keep making it. We ignore the realities of what these solutions propose, and that's why we propose them as false solutions. Through the Decolonizing Climate Policy Project, we're in the thick of it with phase 2, where we have developed an advisory council made up of the different biomes of Canada. And the point of the biomes of Canada, as opposed to just 5 Indigenous representatives or 6 representatives, because we have a youth rep as well, is identifying that we need to start letting the land speak, and not just whether it's who's in control. Is it a chief? Is it council? Is it hereditary chief? Is it Treaty 1? Is it Treaty 2? Is it Treaty 3? We really need to start listening to the land and going back to those kinds of solutions. That's where this tenet came from when formulating the advisory council. And I'd gotten, I don't know if you guys are all familiar with TikTok, but I had recently gotten tagged in a couple of times into one TikTok that was like, how do you decolonize? Well, you just do it. You just decolonize. And I I got called in for saying decolonize quite a bit without a real explanation. And I think, Ariel, I got you quoted here as doing real justice to what that looks like and how that could look in current times. So this work envisions the world where we Indigenous-led climate solutions are the standard, and where colonial structures are doing the work to figure out their resources and knowledge can offer support to existing knowledge systems, not the other way around. So let's flip the script. What more do you need from us? This will require the deconstruction and undoing of current systems to create space for our own independent processes, and plans to build around a more holistic, interconnected, balanced approach based on reciprocity and respect within the natural world. I don't know if that's weird, quote yourself back to you, but I feel like this is a really good example of what it means to decolonize our systems and how we can approach that in this worldview. So with that, I'll hand it off because I'm sure I'm at time and my slides are all over the place. So I truly apologize for that. But Augustana and Anas Mitten for allowing me to speak today, even though I'm sure there are other language speakers out there right now going, what is she saying? I'm trying. Thank you.
Thank you, Masicho. Never apologize for speaking your language wrong. I've heard from elders that as long as you're trying, Creator knows and can hear you and understand you. And I think that's really important, that we don't shun and shame when we speak wrong, but we work to correct properly. But thank you. I think that this articulation around the fact that Rebecca brought forward around how nature-based solutions come from our communities, that needs to be realized, that nature-based solutions are not a new idea. However, they are emerging as being co-opted and appropriated within the UN FCCC spaces, so the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change. So within the UN climate discourse spaces, we're seeing this being co-opted, not just by the UN, but even by the COP presidency. So the country that hosts the COP this year is the UK, more specifically Scotland, is saying we need to be defining nature-based solutions and making sure that we have nature-based solutions. Yet Indigenous peoples remain excluded from those conversations. And when we are, it's just to justify that they have had us in the discussion as opposed to letting us lead. So getting to Rebecca's land back, these don't work unless it's within our determinations, unless we're leading this process. And lastly, we cannot commodify it because it will allow polluters to continue to pollute. We'll offset it here with Indigenous lands and territories. So for years, there was this demonization of Indigenous peoples and our relationship to land. You know, we were pagans, that we were people that why would you want to live off the land? I remember there was, even in my community where we have tar sands, the mayor of Fort McMurray once said, I don't know why you would want to drink straight from the water. No one drinks straight from the water. You get your water from the tap. And now we're talking about nature-based solutions and listening to nature and being in relationship with nature as this co-optation. Yet as little as a decade ago, the relationships that Indigenous peoples had with the land was demonized and devalued, and in many cases criminalized when we looked to stand up for our lands and territories. And now they're looking to not only control it, but to benefit from it, because the only reason they're interested is because it now can be a way to offset and to continue business as usual. And this is where the big risks to Indigenous peoples lie. With that, I invite our next speaker, Thomas Joseph, who has been working with a coalition and team of amazing folks that are working on a project called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which we can share some links for, which highlight the suite of false solutions that are being proposed within the climate negotiations and how we can shift away from these things. It's a really great publication, but we're inviting Thomas to share with us some of these false solutions, and particularly how this relates to the upcoming negotiations of the COP26 and Article 6. So with that, Joseph, please introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariel and Rebecca both. That has been amazing. My name's Thomas Joseph. Excuse me of the sunlight. I got booted outside. My house is being hosted as a coming of age ceremony is underway. And so that's a primarily female-led part. So I got the boot. So I'm out here on the land, which Rebecca was talking about the importance of being on our trails. I am a Hoopa Valley tribal member, and I'm currently on the Hoopa Valley Reservation, which is located on the Trinity River in what's now known as Northern California. The Hoopa Valley tribe is the largest land-based tribe in currently known as California, the state of California, which brings false solutions right to our door, which is Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. And I'm glad Ariel will be sharing those links with us, because that will be able to dive in a little bit deeper on your own time, and because there is a vast array of false solutions that is being proposed. And when we think about, addressing climate change, we have to put into consideration how colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy and white supremacy has led the charge in global warming. It is the foundation and the reason why we are seeing what we are seeing in California when it comes to massive wildfires. And, we've been in drought for a very long time. And, understanding that those factors are also now playing a central role in how we address climate change. And as we continue to use patriarchy and capitalism with this colonial mindset, and not bringing in people that are most affected by climate change because of racism and white supremacy, that it's not going to change. That the globe will continue to warm, and that when these false solutions are being proposed, it's being proposed in the mindset that this is how you do business. And when we start developing carbon markets or other mechanisms to commodify our Mother Earth, we're not going to find real solutions to addressing or reducing emissions at source. And that now we're now also experiencing the commodification of our air and carbon. And so, yeah, here in Northern California, we have been working diligently for the removal of 4 hydro dams along the Klamath River, which will restore fish populations and all of the biodiversities. And we can see that being prolonged or even not moving forward, because those hydro dams will now be proposed as green energy. And these mega dams that produce very little energy probably won't be removed for that same purpose. And in our area here, we have been proposed multiple times for what we call carbon markets, which is also another false solution, where one could sell the forest that's going to sequester carbon that the polluters can continue to pollute. And when we think about a market-based system and we think about capitalism, you have to think about who owns those properties, who not only who owns that land, but who owns the sequestration of that air. And so then it becomes a property debate on whose property is it. And so when one sells the right to sequester carbon, so Shell or any other agency can continue to pollute, they're actually putting claim to that land. Maybe not in title and deed, but they're saying we own this. And so when you think what Ariel was stating earlier, as Indigenous peoples own 80% of the world's biodiversities, is this just colonialism all over again? Is this an additional land grab to Indigenous peoples and the biodiversity is what's left on the globe because of our ability to be in relationship with land and place and know the importance of being in a reciprocal relationship and caring for our land, that now the only biodiversity is left in the world is the biodiversity is left in Indigenous tenure? And so this is an actual land grab for those biodiversities, that these carbon markets are mechanisms and schemes not only to allow polluters to continue to pollute, but to undermine the sovereign right and the tenure over these remaining biodiversities. And so that's all about hoodwinked, and a little bit more about, we talk about carbon capture and storage, which received hundreds of millions of dollars in the COVID bailout in the United States, where they're going to capture carbon, turn it into a liquid state, put it back into the ground to pump for more oil. And so not only is there no reduction of emissions, it's actually increase of emissions. And if you look at carbon markets throughout the globe, there has been no reduction of emissions. They have all increased emissions. And RED, which is a reforestation, I better read it. Anyway, there's RED Plus. There's all these acronyms, and there's a bunch of them. And so there's RED Plus, and so when we think about these false solutions, that's the purpose and intent of why we're going to COP26, is to address Article 6. And Article 6 in COP26 is basically pertaining to how it's the only part of the Paris Climate Agreement that they haven't yet agreed upon. And so this is what they're trying to do, is get everybody to agree upon. And what we have real concerns about is Article 6 and point 2, which is ITMOs, which is internationally traded mitigation outcomes for nationally determined contributions. And so you have these nation states that are saying we need to get to 1990 level standards of CO2 reduction. And if we do it and we meet our agreements, And these other countries that have not met their agreements, primarily countries of the global north, they can trade those and sell those. I know it kind of gets confusing. Even when even when I'm speaking, it kind of gets a little bit out there. But if you can trade those outcomes for other countries that have already met their agreements, then you're saying that these countries in the global south are also holding a responsibility, are selling their forest or whatever for carbon offsets for corporations in the north. And so there's also 6.4, which is sustainable development mechanisms to take over clean development mechanisms, which was coming from the Kyoto Protocol. Now, we know that the Kyoto Protocol fell on its face, and it wasn't any foundation to move forward in how to address climate change, and that those carbon market mechanisms were not only didn't decrease emissions, it was a way just to continue to let the polluters pollute. And so underneath the Paris Climate Agreement, they're just changing a few of those words around, but it's exactly the same thing. And so then the 6.8, which is nature-based solutions or nature-based approaches, which Rebecca really stepped into pretty well, is just that they're using indigenous knowledge to address climate change, and they're saying it also leaves a lot of room for not the real food, like the GMOs and the fake food, and they're going to be paying these corporations to produce food, as supposedly they're going to also sequester carbon. Well, they're already sequestering carbon, but we don't need to be bailing out big farm industry in order to address climate change. And so our main arguments about Article 6 is the adaptation funds should be kept out of the conservation and NGO guidance. Carbon markets have not succeeded to reduce greenhouse emissions for over 20 years. We already know it's a scam and it doesn't work. And what are well-functioning carbon markets? We'll see on the other side that they'll say, well, there's just some quirks and kinks that we need to work out with these carbon markets, but the overall policy of it is going to be a good thing in addressing climate change. No, it's not. There is no mathematical scheme that you can create to make it look good. All you're doing is you're cooking the books. You know that greenhouse growth opportunities and offsets are just offsets and net zeros. And so, when a company says they're going net zero, there is no net zero. You're just cooking your books. You can't produce 3 tons of carbon and buy four tons of offsets and think that you're going to be below zero. You're still increasing your emissions. And innovations and technology costs are dog whistles for geoengineering and satellite technology for measuring trees. And we do not want the so-called green projects. These are offsets, RED+, NBSs, and PESs. And so those are the main purposes of why we're going to COP26. Again, I just want to kind of wrap it back down to the beginning, that we really need to understand the vital role that colonialism is continuing to play in climate change. And that if we don't understand that white supremacy isn't playing a role either, then the communities that are being mostly affected, like you can see in California and other parts of the United States, that these fossil fuel structures are in communities of color. And that if we don't bring grassroots people to the forefront, this will continue to plague communities of color and people that are most impacted. And that capitalism is what caused climate change, and we can't look to capitalism as solutions for climate change. We need to have real solutions, and those solutions come from grassroots folks, and real solutions are solved locally. It's solved in your communities at home. So with that, I'll pass this back to Ariel. Thank you, Ariel.
Wow. Thank you so much, Thomas. That was like such a great articulation of the challenges and issues that we face as Indigenous peoples when we are onslaughted with all of these false solutions, these capitalist, white supremacist, colonial solutions that just allow big polluters to continue polluting. I liked it's like cooking the books. I think that's a really, 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 really clear description, because what they're saying, and just to give this really clearly, is like, here we have, let's say, Shell, oil, having an operation, and suddenly we start defining nature-based solutions as, you know, ecosystems-based approaches. So nature can provide us with all of these solutions, but now we're saying, oh, and it also sequesters carbon. They're not creating anything new by creating a conservation zone in an already biodiverse rich area that is biodiverse because of Indigenous stewardship for thousands and thousands of years, but they're now capitalizing on it. They now buy it, and then they oftentimes, it leads to a diminished ability for Indigenous peoples to access those lands and territories. And this has actually happened within the program that was a sort of beta test program, or RED, the reduction of emissions of deforestation and degradation that Thomas spoke of, where they tried to do this program with Indigenous communities, where they're like, we want to pay you for protecting your land and living in your land as you always have. And it was corporations and sometimes states, and they're like, because we needed to offset some of our high emissions activities. So fossil fuel extraction, sometimes agriculture, deforestation, things like that. And our mega hydro, really great example. We want to make sure that we understand mega hydro is not a solution. But within that context, they want to offset. But what ended up actually happening is they get to cook the books by saying, oh, look, we're going to buy this offset program. And then they have control over Indigenous lands and territories. In the Global South, in some of these projects, it led to communities being told they could no longer harvest at certain times of the years. They could no longer access their lands and territories at certain times of the years because they wanted to increase the biodiversity and the carbon sequestration values of those lands, which meant that Indigenous peoples needed to be removed from. And that was a major problem. That became a major issue that we saw being framed within these programs. In addition to that, carbon market mechanisms don't work. Thomas said that very explicitly. The carbon markets were first proposed in Kyoto as part of the clean development mechanisms. And we have not actually seen a reduction of emissions since Kyoto. We've actually seen an increase of nearly 10% of global emissions since Kyoto, as opposed to a reduction, which is a clear indication that carbon market mechanisms do not work. And before we start, I want to say thanks. I encourage you all to take a look at Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. It's a really great publication. Thank you so much, Thomas. But before I move on to Graham, I wanted to show you this video because last year at the COP, the carbon market mechanisms and the solutions that were being put forward within Article 6 were really a contentious issue. And I want to share a clip from an Indigenous youth representative from New Zealand as she spoke within the plenary around the dangers of these solutions. Technology, I gotta do this thing here. This is from The Guardian, but I'm just using a small clip.
We are experts on climate. We are the kaitiaki, the stewards of nature. We know the legitimacy of our voices, and it's about time that you recognized it too. Hear our stories, learn our histories, stop taking up space with your false solutions, and get out of our way.
I just love that articulation from Kira. She is such an outstanding young woman doing such incredible work within the climate movement. But this is where we're at. It's time for us to demand recognition of our rights. And it's imperative that we move forward in a way that respects not just Indigenous rights, but human rights, and that we demand that we don't allow mechanisms for polluters to continue to pay. With that, I would like to introduce our last speaker. Unfortunately, Janine Yazzie was unable to make it with us today. There's still a chance she might make it in the tail end, but we're unsure. But Graham Reid, who works with the AFN as well as the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, is also an academic studying, working on his PhD, just tremendous amount. Graham, I don't know how he has enough hours in a day to do all the things that he does. Maybe he doesn't know either. But Graham has been working on the issues within the UNFCCC and the COP spaces for some time, but has also undertaken his own studies to look at the dangers of nature-based solutions. So with that, I'd like to invite Graham to share with the viewers today.
Yeah, miigwech, Ariel, and miigwech to Rebecca and Thomas. I have to rework some of the things that I was going to say, because I think both of them hit on everything that I wanted really to communicate. So Anin Bojo, Graham Reid, Indigenous Cause, Ottawa, Nunjapa, Anishinaabe, and Dao. It's an honor to join this virtual space in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, what's currently known as Vancouver, and really excited to potentially share just any incremental additions to what was already extremely well articulated. And I guess I would focus my remarks on the UNFCCC and the space that is created through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think it's worthwhile to understand how that space is effectively an extension of the systems of capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy and white supremacy that Thomas and Rebecca shared. And I think it's worth reiterating that in the context of how do Indigenous peoples participate as nations with their rights affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as their inherent rights, in a system that actually actively excludes them and doesn't consider them as nations that should be at the decision-making table. And so I find that this sort of recognition is often overlooked, especially by parties in that context, and it's worth kind of envisioning what are the steps of dismantling that is required to really truly address those systems of oppression and power where these decisions occur. And so you heard from Thomas and Ariel and Rebecca a little bit about the lengths that Indigenous peoples have to go to even get their voices heard in these frameworks. The other thing that I think is just useful kind of framing within at least the most recent Paris Agreement, and also connects to the massive failure of emission reductions connected to Kyoto, is the tendency for these large international multilateral agreements to be voluntary. And so the Paris Agreement is unfortunately an example of voluntary commission or voluntary commitments that parties need to make. They need to, every 5 years declare that they are going to reduce greenhouse gases, and to a certain extent leading to that temperature commitment of 2 degrees, to do everything under their power to 1.5. And the unfortunate reality is that there is no mechanism of redress for a failure to actually achieve those reductions. Canada is a very good example of a country that continues to miss emission targets. We're projected to produce more oil and gas in 2050 than we are in 2019, based on our own Canadian energy regulators' data. And the implication of that, I think, lands very squarely on this conversation we're having around false solutions, and the incongruency between commitments on climate, offsets, or nature-based solutions, or whatever kind of framing there is, and the root cause and root problem of the ongoing extraction of fossil fuels. And we know that has been well articulated in multiple different reports for generations. And yet we seem not to have the political courage to address the very important and evident elephant in the room. And part of that, in the context of the UNFCCC, is the inability to get polluters out of the conversation. And we know that for several years, not only are nation states with their own conflicts of interest, Canada being a pretty good example of that, but also in the hosting of different conferences that are supported by the industries that are contributing the most to the ongoing catastrophic impacts of climate. in Katowice a couple of years ago, we had a Polish coal company that was one of the main sponsors of the event itself, and had a pavilion with coal in its space, which in my mind is absolutely bonkers. But it also connects to the point that Thomas, I think, made really eloquently about this kind of unearthing of the foundational problem being that there's this tendency to try to solve the results of extractive capitalism with more capitalism. And we see that in the way in which the conversations on offsetting is occurring, on market mechanisms, on nature-based solutions, on, et cetera, and we avoid the, ongoing potential for another form of climate imperialism, where, we have these global north countries that are responsible for anywhere around 90 to 93% of global cumulative emissions, that are essentially going to build their economies to continue to extract and then offset it through, partnerships with the global south. And we seem to perpetuate this model of extraction that really, I think, foundationally relates to those principles of supremacy, of patriarchy, of colonialism that was spoken about. And I think as part of that, we often don't talk about the implications of a energy transition and the minerals required to support active decarbonization. Almost all of us likely have lithium products in our near vicinity, given the use of batteries in them. We know from Madrid that we had relatives in Chile that actually had their water source, I guess, diverted from their community to the lithium farm. And, we likely will continue to see that sort of indirect relationship that the energy transition has, unless we really think about the implications of that. And for me, that highlights the spectrum of false solutions that I think are relevant for this conversation. Obviously, we have those like clear examples of greenwashing. Just last week, we had Shell called out at a TED session in Edinburgh or Glasgow. But the other spectrum of that I think is almost more nefarious is this desire for incrementalism and the perpetuation of status quo. And that's I think for all of the folks around the room, that's the types of solutions that don't have an equity analysis, don't have a power analysis, don't have a colonial analysis, and then we're essentially perpetuating all of these root causes that seem to all center around that model of colonization and capitalism that seem to just perpetuate this extraction of women and of labor and of the land. And so I think it's, for our conversation, those solutions that Rebecca talked about really kind of getting back to, our core relationship to the land around us is central to the disruption of these power structures that seem to find their ways into these conversations at the UNFCCC, at the September Climate Week that's held in New York every year, and that's led by these large energy companies or these large conservation organizations that don't have the critical analysis that centers Indigenous self-determination and rights. And I think part of that is well articulated or well exemplified, has a good example in the framing of nature-based solutions. And we know, and Ariel and Rebecca articulated this quite well, that in the conversations that I've had with elders, all of our solutions are nature-based. The problem is that when we think about nature-based solutions in that mindset of commodification and of scarcity and of competition, we perpetuate the ongoing kind of extraction and I guess monetizing of the elements around us, and by extension, the relationship that we have with those elements around us. And so really what I see is the opportunity in this space and in the conversations that we're trying to have is, how do we take a step back and really start to have that critical analysis of, you know, what are these solutions and where do they stem from? Where are the systems of knowledge that they seem to uphold? And to Rebecca's point of quoting actually Ariel, how do we flip this narrative, flip the script, as Rebecca said? So we're focusing on how do we center, you know, our systems of knowledge and the development of the solutions that are required. And I think that the example of getting back on the land, rebuilding that language and that relationship as central examples of, you know, Indigenous-led climate solutions. And I'm hopeful that, you know, through these conversations and through the parallel spaces that, you know, Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous caucuses creates, we start to gain that kind of critical momentum for, you know, how do we really return to that narrative of, you know, centering land, not only as the relationship that we carry with it, but also the relationship that land has with all the more than humans around it, and how are nature-based solutions in that context really about enabling nature or land to uphold its responsibilities with the land around it. And we seem to be stuck in this mindset of inconsistency between, oh, well, we're going to conserve an area over here, but we're going to maintain urban sprawl over there. And this kind of, you know, just this inconsistency of how do we treat those relations in the way that we were taught through our teachings, you know, is really problematic. And I think that the last thing that I'll tie back into the UNFCCC that I thought was highlighted by that video and also by the work of ICA and IEN and others is the centering of that narrative of oceans and land back. And I think as part of that, and as part of, you know, those who are listening that may misunderstand what that concept is about, we need to avoid the interpretation of those concepts through the lenses of property and ownership, and instead interpret them through, you know, our nexus of people, reciprocity, and land. And I'm hopeful that, you know, through having and engaging in these conversations, you know, we can start to do the work that Rebecca and others are doing on really decolonizing climate policy, and by extension, decolonizing the UNFCCC writ large. So I'll maybe stop there and say Chimiigwech and look forward to the questions in the chat.
Well, thank you so much. I think that there's so many things that were hit in all of the presentations today. You know, really sort of getting to the fact that, kind of going back to Thomas and speaking to Thomas's remark about cooking the books, because I think what we're seeing right now within the negotiations surrounding Article 6, which is really about operationalizing the Paris Agreement. This is all about all these states trying to find a way to meet their commitments to keep global temperatures 1.5 degrees below industrial levels. But they're trying to do it in a way that that is done incrementally, as Graham talked about, and maintaining the status quo of energy consumption, the status quo of emissions production and releases into the atmosphere, and is really not looking at like how we cannot maintain those levels if we are going to actually have stable energy transfers, and that these groups are looking for anything to cook the books. And we're seeing this being negotiated within Article 6 and the proposals of these false solutions to be included. And it's not just about false solutions, folks. Like, it is absolutely critical to understand that while we're seeing false solutions, the same things that are happening within Article 6 is they're looking for ways to double count their emissions, like reductions. They're looking for ways to take money from the same finances that they're doing to to help them reduce emissions, they're actually giving it back to the same corporations that are producing the emissions. They're looking for all sorts of different ways to sort of cross-cut their costs from an economic standpoint for them to continue business as usual. And that we're seeing this really rear its ugly head when we see the corporate sponsorship, whether it's a corporate sponsorship of dialogues within the UN spaces, or it's corporate sponsorship of Indigenous protected and conservation areas, or for language programs, and so on and so forth. We're seeing people trying to buy our consent to allow these things to continue business as usual. I think it's really, really imperative to understand how nature-based solutions in a commodified framework to be included in these offset programs reduces forests and ecosystems to its functions as carbon sinks. And it completely disconnects the relationships that Indigenous peoples have held for thousands of years that have led to these systems being protected and preserved and for their rich ecosystems. And it also doesn't look, and it looks at as Indigenous peoples now as something to contribute to CO2 like sequestration value. We're not actually being people. We're looked at as commodities to be traded. Our knowledge systems are being commodities to be traded. We have to ensure that there are safeguards within all of these mechanisms that recognize human rights and the unique rights of Indigenous peoples, which we discussed on some of our earlier webinars, which I encourage you to look at. Programs like nature-based solutions in a commodified trading system really further put our communities at risk. These are land grabs. These are things that don't uphold the tenets of a just, our climate justice framework. And I want to read this because I think it's important when we talk about a just transition or energy transitions and how nature-based solutions themselves are not actually dangerous. Like nature-based solutions, we should be doing them. We should be having ecosystem-based approaches. We should be listening to nature. We should be conserving and protecting these spaces, but we shouldn't be commodifying them because it doesn't uphold the tenets of a climate justice framework. And so I'm going to read a little area from Hoodwinked in the Hothouse because I love this articulation of climate justice. Climate justice, a climate justice framework does not reduce the climate crisis to a puzzle simply focused on counting carbon. Grassroots, community-led movements around the world look across the economy. We look past it. We look at the exploitation of land, labor, and living systems, at the erosion of seed, soil, story, and spirit, and seek to lift up real solutions around us every day, from traditional ecological knowledge, food sovereignty, the decommodification of land, healthcare and housing, to abolishing the military-industrial complex seeking to extract the last dredges of fossil fuels from Mother Earth. From just transition to energy democracy, where democratized, decentralized, detoxified, and decarbonized energy powers our lives, to transformative justice, where we respond to violence and trauma with compassion and healing, not policing, punishment, and prisons. Climate justice centers organizing, direct action, and community-based decision-making by those on the front lines of the crisis, who are also at the front lines of change. That's that articulation that we are our own experts. In essence, people whose efforts are guided by shared principles and a common vision of restoring our relations with the earth and each other, and embracing relationships that cultivate a decolonized worldview of respect, reciprocity, mutuality, and solidarity across all communities with the rest of the living world and with Mother Earth. I think it's essential to understand that what our articulations here are from this group is that we are not saying that we shouldn't be looking to nature for solutions. What we are saying is that we should not commodify nature. We are saying that current mechanisms, carbon market mechanisms, are not the solutions. And we absolutely must be looking for ways to recenter Indigenous values as a guiding principle that those values are centered in those relationships with the land that have led to 80% of the world's biodiversity being in the hands of our communities. And if we are going to actually see that and grow that as a movement, it's not about corporate sponsorship. It's about returning the land back to our communities. It is about land back. Giving Indigenous peoples tenure and the responsibilities to guide our lands and territories is what we need. We need to release the paternalistic approaches of colonial governments deciding where nature-based solutions are. We need to relinquish ourselves from the colonial governments and systems of white supremacy that say that they know better than us. We are our own experts. And we're really lucky because Janine actually just joined us. And she is here. Oh, look at, and she's calling from an airport because she's so diehard and she's so amazing. I'm gonna hand it over to Janine before we open it up for some Q&A. I'll just give you a brief. We've talked about nature-based solutions, what they are, as well as Article 6 and the fact that this is a carbon market mechanism. We've talked about how this is just a scheme to cook the books based on colonial systems of white supremacy and capitalism, and that this is also a way to continue the false solution narratives that are pushed under greenwashing for incremental change to maintain status quo and don't address the fact that energy transition can't happen unless we absolutely have a just transition that looks at the rights of communities that are further marginalized even by some of these other solutions like, you know, solar and wind that require lithium and other resources. And so this is our articulation. I would invite you to share a little bit about your own journey on nature-based solutions and Article 6 and false solutions that are being negotiated within the UNFCCC. And also introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I came in at the right time. You were on fire as soon as I tuned in. But hi, everyone. Janine Yazzie, Dene from the Navajo Nation, and I'm CEO and co-founder of Six World Solutions. And like, yeah, I feel like you covered it perfectly. You know, one of the questions that I've been getting a lot leading up to this COP is really one that's based out of fear. Like, what are we going to lose? Like, what's at stake? Like, how important are the decisions coming out of COP? And although a lot of these things, like what they're promoting with Article 6 and with you know, the whole push around and discussion around nature-based solutions, we will get new challenges and obstacles if they're allowed to continue to promote these false solutions and these frameworks that do nothing to dismantle the very structures and systemic inequalities that you were talking about earlier when I popped on, and I'm sure covered throughout this webinar. But one of the things that Indigenous peoples have been doing phenomenal at is holding the line in those negotiations to make sure that, one, no Article 6 language or negotiation is passed without the critical discussion and a lot of pointing out the evidence about how it's a false solution. So we can't let these countries, you know, win the narrative war around this. And convince people that it is meaningful or effective action. And that's where Indigenous peoples and our narratives and our solutions have been really important in informing the discussions, but also in our collective negotiation strategy to ensure that safeguards are included in the language for Article 6, because we know that when we hold countries and governments accountable to upholding the rights of frontline communities, of Indigenous peoples, of communities that are in the forefront of climate change and the solutions, the so-called solutions that are being proposed to climate change, when their rights are upheld, it makes it harder to justify and implement a lot of these solutions, because when they're developed under these colonial institutions and they do nothing to dismantle these power systems, those solutions will continue to lead to the violations of basic human rights. They will continue to manifest as threats to the lands, territories, and resources of Indigenous peoples, and they will continue to hinder real effective action that's needed for all of our communities all around the globe, as is evidenced by a lot of the studies that have come out prior in the past months leading up to COP, trying to bring both awareness to the sense of urgency and the conditions that a lot of our communities are dealing with, but also I think really to inform us that we're in this together. And in these spaces, it can be very harrowing when participating in these, they're so stressful. So, prayers to and support to all of our Indigenous relatives that it will be showing up to COP26 in Glasgow. They can be very stressful and very disheartening, but at the same time, it becomes more and more obvious that what happens in those spaces do nothing to prevent the solutions that we need to build as Indigenous peoples when we build our collective power. We'll still have that opportunity to do that. So there, it's our relatives that are there are going to need a lot of support to hold the ground and ensure that nothing is compromised and these false solutions aren't further promoted.
Thank you so much, Janine. I think like these are all important things. That this has ultimately become a narrative war, which is really kind of a strange thing to think about. But the reality is that's what it is. We know that there are false solutions. There have been numerous studies to prove that the carbon market mechanisms don't work, yet they're still being proposed within these structures because they benefit those that are promoting them and pursuing them. And we absolutely have to look at a human rights framework in order to advance these issues, and that we absolutely cannot continue to see Article 6 negotiated without Indigenous peoples, without civil society, without those that are going to be most impacted by it. And it's, I know that Janine is not able to join us at this COP this year, along with many Indigenous peoples that are not going to be able to come. As Rebecca stated, the COP is not a space that is really made for our communities. It was made for colonial states and for their partners, who in this case are capitalist partners, corporations. And so we are up against a big challenge as we enter into these spaces. But what we do have on our side is the strength of our communities, the strength of our knowledge, the strength of our ancestors that bring us into these spaces and allow our voices to be heard. But we also need the people to listen. So I want to thank the panelists for sharing so much. And there's a lot of really, really big questions in here. So I'm going to try to pick some good questions from this. One of the, I think this one's actually is a good question. So it's from an anonymous person. It says, thank you for sharing your perspectives with us. Would making a distinction between activity-based and land-based carbon rights have any benefit to Indigenous peoples in terms of preventing the new form of colonialism that Thomas discussed? So like, would it be better to like make a distinction between activity-based and land-based carbon rights? I think it's a funny question, and I think it's worth answering. Did someone, I mean, I can't ask for clarification. All we can do is read the question. Go ahead.
I would just like to add that when we think about the benefits to Indigenous communities, when we're thinking about carbon markets, because there is a dollar amount that is attached when you sign a 100-year contract for a carbon market, benefits of that money can be used for. We understand that Indigenous communities have high rates of diabetes, high rates of all the issues that we face with housing and poverty, that if those issues can be addressed by selling off your land for carbon sequestration, being used as a carbon sink for a creation of a carbon market to allow polluters to pollute, what is the real benefit to those Indigenous tribes? Because some tribes have signed carbon markets contracts. And with that, we have yet to see those dollars really affect what's going on the ground in those communities, that those dollars really never do meet the people or the needs of those communities. And more so on a global scale, we know that especially here in California and across the globe in Indigenous communities, how we are all affected by climate change, and that we are all connected with this globe warming and with droughts and with massive fires and with massive storms. And so we are connected. And if we are going to allow our lands as carbon sinks for corporations to continue to pollute and to continue to warm this globe, there is no real benefit, especially for future generations. And that the monetary benefit never really does get to the people that need it the most, that are on the ground. And so I would say no, and that the values that are compromised by signing these contracts really hinder real climate solutions to come forward, and real climate and real reduction of emissions to be met, because those tribes that do sign these carbon market contracts are held as a pedestal, saying, well, these communities are receiving benefit and gain from these carbon markets. How can you say that they're not? Well, we know that they're not, because the communities are on the ground are not receiving any real aid. And that was talked about earlier. Some of these communities are actually pushed from their lands because, like in my community, I can speak, we do a lot of material for, gather a lot of material for baskets. We gather a lot of material for our traditional foods. That can become limited if these carbon market agreements are signed, because those plants that are growing our food and those plants that we use for our basket material are also sequestering carbon. And so those corporations can limit our access to that. And we've seen in South and Central America how Indigenous people actually have been removed from those lands because of these carbon markets. And so there is no real benefit. It might be monetary, and you can hope and pray that that monetary gets to the people in need. I doubt that it does.
Thank you, Thomas. I think that it really speaks to what we've already seen happen with the imposition of fossil fuel or companies in our, or deforestation companies in our territories, is what we've coined as the ransom economy. It's pegging the fact that we're dealing with socioeconomic issues in our communities that that are being underfunded and under-resourced by colonial governments, and that the corporations come in to save our communities, and it puts us in a situation where we're in these economic hostage situations. So I think it's a really, really real thing where we have to be very careful on like how we are approaching this. Another question that I think would be great, because I think it's a really good distinction and like connection, is do any speakers have thoughts on the UN Food System Summit or agriculture in general at the COP? And I know that Janine has done some of the work in UN food systems and its connections to this, because Thomas did speak to the fact that in some cases, big agriculture is looking for these monoculture crops as potential carbon offsets. And then they're selling those food systems back into a capitalist market, and they're sort of double dipping. They're getting like both like carbon offsets and financial gain while displacing potentially indigenous peoples or destroying biodiversity for the benefits. So I know Janine, you've done some of that work. Would you like to speak to those connections for the UN food systems and the work?
Yeah, I think one of the clearest connections that's in line with what's being said is that all of these institutions have been developed by the same powers and structures of power that created a lot of the problems we're dealing with in the first place. So their first and primary goal is self-preservation. And with the Food Summit being, having established itself to tackle the issues around food systems, sustainability, and resiliency, what we're seeing is the same patterns, that these countries are really in partnership with corporations, and that there's constant corporate capture of what the pathways and solutions need to look like, and how those resources then get divvied up. And so a lot of times participating in these discussions can kind of feel it more like it's tying your hands than doing anything to help address the situations that our communities find ourselves in. But with the Food System Summit, the Indigenous peoples, I think, are creating such a strong alliance and foundation and platform for collaborating across our different ecosystems and across the globe to really think about this question about what we would need to protect and promote our traditional food systems and lifeways. And it comes down to the same thing, like we have to have our rights respected. Any solutions, any effective, meaningful solutions need to be rights-based. And our traditional knowledge, again, and practices hold a key for building what those alternatives look like. And again, we face the same challenges that we do in the UNFCCC, except more so because it's a new body with the UN Food Systems Summit, where they have all the language, they've learned all the language to talk about how important the indigenous peoples are to the solutions, but where they're also ensuring that we don't have an independent voice in those processes. And so we're fighting very hard to make sure that that doesn't get solidified. And there's groups of people that are leading that fight, like International Indian Treaty Council, as well as other international indigenous organizations. So staying on top of the work that they're doing would be really important, and being informed about that process. They helped organize the first International Indigenous Peoples caucus on global food systems. They all have such long names. Forgive me if I messed that up. But yeah, where we're doing the same thing, they're doing the same thing, and they're fighting the same fight that's being fought in the UNFCCC negotiations.
Yeah, that's a really great point, that we're dealing with the same struggles across all of the UN mechanisms, and like that is the issue. I think also getting to some of the points around like the invisibilization of Indigenous peoples as actual at the decision-making level, but how we're often mentioned. Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous stewardship has safeguarded 80% of the biodiversity. And I know, like Rebecca, you have worked on some of this stuff, and you talked about land back in your presentation. And we have sort of two questions related to land back, and I'd love to hear from both Graham and Rebecca on this. But the question is how it's twofold, so you can either choose which one. But how do we convince the people who are privileged under the colonial status quo to implement land back and relinquish control to allow Indigenous sovereignty? And so this person works for Indigenous Research, Climate Change Institution. It's all about influencing policy and trying to impact change at the COP and UNFCCC and the US government, but they're ignorant about the co-opting of nature-based solutions and all the truth that has been addressed here. So how do we move from like people thinking that this is the right way to go, giving land back to Indigenous peoples? And then on the other side of that question, someone said, how are Indigenous people to take back full responsibility of their lands on reservations when they've bared the brunt of the effects of colonialism, and so to their tribal governments? How do we come back from that and yet move forward as stewards of our land? So not only how do we convince people to give us our land back, or fulfill the land back movement, which is not necessarily to physically give us our land back, but then how do we take that and undo those levels of colonization to become those stewards? So, I mean, I give it to Rebecca and Graham just because I haven't asked you guys questions yet, but yeah.
I find those kinds of questions sort of funny, because it requires more than just one person to answer that. It requires a giant group of Indigenous folks to answer that. So how do we move forward? We start putting the resources forward so that Indigenous folks can come and make those decisions together and give those assertions to their governments. Without those resources for us to come together, then it's always going to be reduced to, what does this one Indigenous person in the room think about this giant issue? And I feel like that's where we need to start changing those systems, where we look in our organizations and we look around and we go, is there just one BIPOC representation? or do we start to see those systems change within those organizations? There's real benefit in having an Indigenous-led organization like ICA, but there's also a real benefit in having allies within, environmental organizations working in the same worldview and mindset as Indigenous folks. So, and then this other question of like, we bear the brunt of colonialism, and how do we move past this? And it's through that land-based education. It's through the education of residential schools and knowing our history and our trauma. And it is only through there that we can get a better grasp on what our future looks like. For myself anyway, it wasn't until I started to learn more about what traumas had went through my family, the intergenerational trauma that went through my family, for me to actually understand my footing in this world and how I need to move forward and how I need to do that with my children. So when I remember listening to a graduation speech at the University of Manitoba, and one of the graduates, and I can't remember her name for the life of me, and I apologize for this, but she had talked about how we're all going through these university systems and we're graduating and we're becoming lawyers and doctors and whatever. But without our language, without our culture, we're contributing to the assimilation. So how do we move forward past these effects of colonialism? We learn our language, we learn from the land, we learn from our elders, and we put the resources towards that. Within our communities, we amplify that voice as Indigenous folks. There's many programs out there. We take those opportunities, we teach our children, we get involved in powwows and whatever we can. And that's my personal journey to that answer, I guess. And I'm sure that there's many different answers to that, because I want to stress that in Canada, we don't have pan-indigeneity. We're not all the same, and we're not all going to approach this the same. That's why there's so much need to have this national conversation about what Indigenous folks can realize the solutions in, I guess, a tangible way, and how we inform policy in that respect. So I have big plans, so I look forward to that, but I'll leave it over to Graham to answer. Thanks.
Yeah, miigwech, Rebecca, and miigwech to Thomas and Janine for your earlier answers. I guess like one thing that I always find really interesting in these frameworks is the recent discovery of Indigenous-led climate solutions and conversations, predominantly by Western institutions. And I think it's I think it's interesting that you know, and relevant that we have like more and more attention, but what's often missed is the decades upon decades of climate and environmental advocacy that, you know, folks like Tom Goldtooth, who is part of IEN, is part of, and, you know, our aunties and uncles around the virtual circle. And we often seem to neglect that when saying, oh, where do we find this information? Like Thomas was saying, they're now the third version of Hoodwinked in the hothouse. We know from Auntie Deb McGregor, who's actually on ICA's Advisory Council for Decolonizing Climate Policy. She always kind of references the long list of Indigenous-led climate declarations stemming as far back from the Rio Convention, which actually, you know, created what we now understand as the UNFCCC. And so I think like one thing that's useful for institutions to think about is like the newness of these conversations is only the selective gaze that they have. And so I'd encourage that, you know, we have more kind of in-depth reflections by Indigenous peoples through those institutions, and to Rebecca's point, through funding Indigenous peoples to have those discussions, because it's, I think, so important. On the second piece, and I really want to echo just the diversity of responses to the prospect of how do we implement land back and the, you know, clear revitalization of our institutions that, you know, continue to be hampered by the shackles of colonialism, and in the, you know, Canadian context, the shackles of the Indian Act and the limitations that are put on, you know, not only our Indian Act Band Council, Chieftain Council, but also our hereditary systems. And, you know, I think as part of that is just the understanding of, you know, the ongoing structural and systemic racism against, you know, in this context, Indigenous peoples and First Nations that continue to see our housing underfunded, continue to see our educational systems underfunded, continue to see our wastewater systems underfunded, our infrastructure underfunded. And so really part of what I see as a meaningful first step is, you know, addressing that chronic underfunding, and then contemplating the conversations about, you know, how do we also at the same time navigate this, you know, assumed jurisdiction of different provinces over, you know, those lands that are Indigenous in nature. And so I think there are a lot of elements of that conversation, and part of, even to the earlier point that Thomas was sharing around that, you know, carbon rights piece, you know, before we even get to the point of commodifying carbon rights, like I feel like we need to understand that, you know, there's an assumption of sovereignty by different provinces or territories to even control those rights in the first place. And I think as we start to decolonize these climate solutions, we need to start at that point rather than, you know, how our First Nations or otherwise taking or making the best of the ongoing manufactured poverty that we're facing. And so maybe I'll stop there.
Such great articulations from everybody. We are wrapping up to the end of this session, but it's been such a powerful articulation of the fact that there's a lot of work that needs to get done for us to achieve the justice frameworks that we're looking for. It's not just about addressing the climate crisis, and as I stated earlier, and reducing it to a carbon accounting problem and a carbon reduction problem, but it's a systemic problem, as Graham and Rebecca talked about, as Thomas talked about, as Janine talked about. This is not simply just about naming false solutions and replacing them with something else within the colonial framework. It's about deconstructing and decolonizing these systems to allow Indigenous peoples and other marginalized and oppressed groups to be able to enter into these forums and contribute in meaningful ways. And as Indigenous peoples, that we are respected as rights holders, not simply stakeholders, and that we have the ability to make decisions about what happens in our lands and territories, and that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is upheld within these structures and within these systems, because it has not been. The reality is that we have unique rights that protect us and allow us to enter into these, that should allow us to enter into these spaces as right holders. Specifically, Article 18 of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples state that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which could affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own decision-making institutions. Yet we're not seeing this happen at the very bodies and by the very states that signed on to this agreement and accepted it. We have to call for more, and we have to call for better in order for us to achieve not just climate stabilization, but climate justice. I would like to invite each panelist to close with some final remarks of what they want to leave, what they want people to leave with from today's session, and how they can also support your work. So I will pass it to Thomas to start us off, just closing remarks.
Thank you. So what I would like everybody to leave with today is just a understanding of the importance of addressing climate change through an Indigenous lens, and knowing that there is no place for capitalism, no place for colonialism as we address our globe that is warming. And an example of that, which we didn't really speak too much today about, is in all this climate talk that we're doing, not one time has a Paris Climate Agreement addressed the #1 polluter in this world, which is the American military industrial complex, and how that this colonial institution to make sure that the United States empire continues to be sustainable is not addressed in climate change, because it's rooted in colonialism, it's rooted in white supremacy, and we will never be able to get to scale at reducing carbon emissions if we keep on looking through climate change through this colonial lens. And the way that you can support my work is to be more aggressive and to be more pushing than ever in this moment of time that we are in as Indigenous peoples, to assert your right, to assert the sovereignty that you hold as an individual and as a tribal nation, because we are all connected. And the further you push, the further that allows us to push, as we're connected through this global network and this global work. And not to think of what can you do on your reservation lands, but what obligation and duty and responsibility do we have to all of our ancestral territories, not defined by a colonial border, but what our ancestors have been obligated and have held responsible to since time immemorial. That those first agreements we still hold the responsibility and duty to uphold those first agreements, which include all of our ancestral territory. And so the further you push, the further I'm allowed to push. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Janine?
Oh my God, I should just say ditto to what Thomas said. Like, hell yeah. But really, you know, I think it was covered quite clearly that these issues that we are fighting in these spaces are issues that are rooted in the colonization of our own homelands back in each of our territories. And even if we don't have the privilege of being in our traditional territories, it's still existent in the territories that we've been displaced to or that we've moved to for one reason or another. And so even if our governments don't act, we still have every responsibility to mobilize those communities and our networks to take the action that is needed to protect and enforce our rights as Indigenous peoples, to stand with Indigenous peoples that are on the front lines of these issues and who are fighting for real, meaningful, and holistic and regenerative solutions. And to stand with and fight with us to properly resource those Indigenous-led solutions. The fight is everywhere. And I think that although we should pay attention and support all of our relatives that will be holding it down at COP, we have to do so with the understanding that this fight extends beyond COP. The strategies that we need to really build and invest in with each other go beyond these places of negotiation and branch out back to our homelands. And so we'll have we have the responsibility to take on this fight in our own way, to hold our ground on our rights, to codify it in everything that we're doing and all of the policies and negotiations and partnerships that we're a part of. And to not back down and not compromise and not buy into the illusion that the only way we'll be able to enact our solutions is when and until these countries fully enforce and expect our rights. That's a lie. We can do that for ourselves, and we have to do it for ourselves.
Thank you so much, Janine. And I'll pass it off to Graham.
Yeah, not much to say. I guess I'll just put a plug into the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion that we have at the UNFCCC, and the unique piece this year is actually we do have a live streaming option, and so there'll be an option to actually hear, not only incredible insight from our relatives, north and south of the medicine line, but also around the world. And I think what's really interesting in these conversations and those creation spaces of our systems of knowledge and our relationships throughout the world is that we often center these sorts of principles in a way that I think speaks truth to the teachings and values that we, work to express with the world around us, those teachings of respect, of courage, of honesty, and of love, things that are often missed in the kind of technocratic, kind of hustle bustle of the COP spaces. And so, not much to say other than Chimigwech to the incredible panelists that were on here and all those who followed, and really look forward to seeing how each of you, essentially enact your concentric circles of action. That's you as an individual, your family, your community, and your nation. And one of the aunties that I work with always tells me about, what we can do as part of these conversations. So yeah, miigwech for that, and really look forward to dismantling all these things together.
Thank you so much, Graham. And Rebecca.
Oh my goodness, echoing what everybody else has already said. And then just to add to it, the benefits of seeing from an Indigenous worldview or an Indigenous point of view is for all of us that live on Earth. And I think that that's something that is often missed from the narrative. It's us versus them and Indigenous land back, and people quite often don't hear this piece that we're doing this for all the relatives on Earth. So the rocks, the trees, the humankind, the four-legged ones, all of it. And that should be that motivates me anyway to continue to do the work that I do. So thank you to all the other panelists that I'm honored to even be on the same stage as y'all. So thank you so much. Agosane.
Thank you so much. And of course, I'm going to give a big plug out to Indigenous Climate Action. Please do consider donating to continue this work on our website, as well as the work of IEN, Indigenous Environmental Network, which Thomas is working alongside of. And we also have the work of AFN, and Janine is working alongside of, she has been working with IITC in the past, but also is working with, I can't remember the name of your organization right now, Janine. But we'll try to put links for all the different organizations and ways that could support the groups here in the chat before we jump off. But I wanted to, 6 World Solutions. Please do. These are frontline Indigenous-led groups and organizations taking on some really big challenges in the world. And we need all the support you can get so we can rebalance the redistribution of wealth and access to resources. And lastly, we have to remember that climate change was caused by colonialism. Colonialism caused climate change. Indigenous peoples are the solution. Let's take that to COP this year. Thank you. Masi Cho, hi. Thank you all for coming today. And the next time you'll see us, we'll be reporting from the ground in Scotland. Take care, everyone.